Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Robertson. I am the animation director at Irrational Games. Now, one of the goals that we have at Irrational is to create strong interactive narrative experiences. And one of the ways that you do that is by creating relationships between the player and the characters in the game. For instance, the relationship between the player and Shodan in System Shock 2. Now, there's definitely a bit of a relationship there. She could react somewhat to what the player was doing, but the player is really only represented through a disembodied voice. Now, in BioShock 1, we brought humans into the space, but these humans were safely kept behind glass or over the radio or in tightly controlled cutscenes where you had no interaction with them at all. And there's no real relationship that you could build with them. There was a relationship that we built in BioShock 1 that was a true relationship, and there was an emotional value there, and that was between the big daddies and the little sisters. They existed in each other's world, they're fully realized, they could react to each other, there's an emotional bond there, but it wasn't your relationship, it was something that you observed. We wanted to take the next step when we started talking about BioShock Infinite and create a companion for the character. Now, in the past, we'd had some experience with companion characters, the officers in SWAT 4. These guys are really robust, and you could talk to any programmer who worked on this game just how difficult it is to get an AI to properly walk through the door like a normal human. But they didn't have any emotion. They're just really extra guns for the player. And in BioShock, the little sisters were companions to the big daddy. And it was a robust relationship, but again, it wasn't your relationship. You didn't participate in it. So the goal for BioShock Infinite's companion was to bring the story fully into the player's space. We wanted her to share that journey and share the narrative with the player. We wanted to have that robust design, again, going through a door properly without just bumping into things. And most importantly at all, we wanted that relationship that the player could emotionally buy into. So today I'm going to talk about how we arrived at the Elizabeth that shipped in the box. I'm going to focus a little bit on animation. I am the animation director after all. But I hope to show that Elizabeth couldn't have been possible without the combination of not only systems, but combination of disciplines, multiple people coming together and working closely together to breathe that illusion of life into her. So where do you begin? How do you create a character that's going to forward the narrative of the story, respond properly to player movement and actions, and elicit an emotional response? So before we figured out anything, before we figured out personality, before we figured out appearance, before we even talked about technical constraints, the first question that we asked, believe it or not, was, can she talk? Now this seems like a simple question. It seems like a cool idea on paper, and certainly in the animation department, we were excited about the possibilities that a mute character would provide for the player. I mean, it's great animation opportunities to get somebody who can't talk to communicate with you. But just because it looks good on paper doesn't mean it's actually going to work. What is the player experience? And this is something I hope to return to throughout this presentation. Like, you have to see your ideas through the player's eyes. So let's figure that out. Let's figure out how it affects the player. Now, this is a quick test that we conducted to prove out how Elizabeth might call out an object of interest to the player. And there should be audio here, but I'm not hearing it, so. No matter, she was grunting through the whole thing because she can't talk. So what's the player experience here? It's very obtrusive. She's forcing the player to look. She's hijacking my entire experience to show me this object. What if I'm in combat? What if I am looting? What if I just want to explore the world? This is a relationship for sure because there's interactions there, but it's not the relationship that we want to build. We want you to actually enjoy being around her, not being annoyed every time she needs to communicate to you. So yes, she has to talk. At the time, we were not confident in our ability to create a talking character, which is why we went so far down the route of creating a character that couldn't talk. But this test showed us that either we're going to cut Elizabeth which was not an option, or we have to move forward with a speaking Elizabeth because the player experience demands it. Now, another thing that we were working on at the time was the problem of facial animation. In BioShock 1, we didn't have a lot of opportunity for this, so it was a bit of a new problem for us. Mute Elizabeth was bad enough. We'd still have to represent her emotion at all times in the game. But the talking Elizabeth definitely leveled up that problem. So we needed a way to deal with the quantity of animation that was coming in, but we also needed a way to deal with the quality and maintain that illusion of life. So we've been playing around with some facial capture technology at the time, and we decided the best way to figure out if we're going to do performance capture or if we're going to do hand-keyed facial animation was to do a side-by-side comparison. So we needed to do an animation test. We wrote a small emotionally charged scene. We hired an actress. We went out to a motion capture studio on Long Island, and we did a full performance capture of the scene. You're going to see the full performance capture on the right-hand side of the screen. We then took all the animation on her face and deleted it completely and just redid the animation hand-keyed back in the studio, and you're going to see that on the left-hand side of the screen. So this is the result. And there should be audio. I don't know. Yeah, it's up. It's not. Well, it'll be a quiet presentation. You're just missing bombastic music here. Again, no talking. All right, what did we learn? Well, for us, the burden of getting the scene right on a day of shoot was very high. Boston is not exactly a hotbed of mocap studios. It wasn't really economical for us to travel, even just down to New York, to do full performance captures. Performance capture, for us, didn't really support the iteration that we needed to do back at Irrational. And for us, remotely directing both the audio and the physical performance was a little too risky for us. And at the time, we didn't even have a tech animator. So all the data that was going to be coming in externally for the performance capture was just a little too much for us to handle. And ultimately, for us, realism was not the goal. The goal was to build an emotional connection to the player. And we don't really need realistic facial animation to achieve that. And we thought that the keyframed animation just looked better. John Mangagill was the animator who worked on this. He was there in the office. We could sit down and we could review the scenes daily. We could iterate when we needed to. We didn't need to bring an actress in. We didn't need to get a mocap studio. It was right there for us. So the exaggeration and the iteration for us really showed us that we wanted to move forward with keyframed animation. But this was definitely time consuming, right? I mean, you're going to now hand key the entire experience of Elizabeth throughout BioShock Infinite. So we needed to set rules so that we weren't going to get mired down in all of this animation. One of the rules, for instance, was a close-up rule for animating Elizabeth and Max. So if she's going to be closer on screen than the top of her head to the tip of her torso, then we were going to animate that completely in Max to the highest fidelity that we could. If she's going to be further away from that, we could let Face Effects handle most of her talking animations and polish as we needed to. But we needed to develop new systems for her facial animation when she wasn't talking. So that was a system that I'll actually talk about later. So now you've probably realized that the examples that I've shown you look nothing like the Elizabeth that we shipped with. While we were conducting these experiments, the concept team was hard at work developing what Elizabeth might look like. Now, as we progressed, we got more comfortable in breaking away from realistic proportions. Now, we did this for two reasons. One, we're a first-person shooter. We never break out of the player's POV. Elizabeth is seen mostly at a distance, believe it or not. You know, some cutscenes she's in really close. But if you take into account the camera FOV, as Elizabeth gets further away from the camera, the pixels representing her face get pretty small. So having exaggerated proportions on her face really can help sell her emotion from across the room. The second main reason for this was the uncanny valley. We are not the studio that's going to leap across the uncanny valley and create this hyper-realistic character that everybody's going to fall in love with. We knew what our limitations were here. For us, realism, again, was not the goal. The emotional connection was the goal. So by staying on the stylization side of the uncanny valley, we gave ourselves a small advantage. So we ended up with a character that we'd hope would play to the person sitting in the last row, so to speak. Knowing your limitations is important here. Right? By staying out of the uncanny valley, we were less worried about the visually realistic AI and more focused on the emotionally believable AI. Oh, sorry. Do you want me to pop out to my desktop real quick? And
make sure that you're plugged into the proper jack there for your audio with that of the DI. What's your DI, the black cable that's over here?
Yeah, it's plugged into the headphone jack.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. All right. Big part of this concept phase involved what Elizabeth was actually wearing. The dress was not negotiable. You think about the time period, America, 1912, the dress is really part of that time of what women were wearing at the time. We also knew that we needed two distinct Elizabeths, at least. The narrative takes us from the young innocent girl that you meet in Monument Island to the older, more powerful and worldly woman that she's going to transform into. Now, every version of Elizabeth shares the same rig. We don't want to do multiple animations on a character this complicated for the same type of movement sets. And for you animators out there, we're in 3D Studio Max using the CAT plugin here. The dress bones can't penetrate Liz's skeleton, so the animators had to create this like stiff cone around her legs when they did the animation. It led to some really awkward play blasts in Max, so the constant mantra here was get the animation in game, because it's really tough to see what she's doing when the dress is stiff like this. We have to see that physical solution of the animation in game. Now, as we started getting into the nitty-gritty of the dress physics, we started to realize why you don't really see a ton of real-time characters that have dresses on. Capes are fine, ponytails are fine, ribbons are fine, but the minute you close that geometry around your character's legs, you're in for a world of trouble. And especially with Elizabeth, her legs are much longer than normal. Again, the proportions that I was talking about here. Because we're a first-person shooter, the player can run much faster than a normal human being can, which means your companion character, who's supposed to be a normal human being, has to also run pretty fast to keep up with you. So we're stuck in between this time where either her legs were poking through the dress when she ran, or the dress would be kept aloft because her legs were moving so fast that the dress would just kind of be up. Neither one of those are quite shippable. So the physics solution basically, once it was successful, once we figured it out, I think it was worth it. We're correct in predicting about how much animation time we'd save with physics. We way underestimated the tech time and requirements that it was going to take to get these physics working. We had one of our tech animators, Gwen Frey, working with a bunch of third-party companies, some of it just full-time, trying to get this right and shippable. I mean, in the end, like I said, I think it's worth it. Getting the dress in and working properly grounded Elizabeth to her time period, but also became a big part of her character. Now, the foundation is set. We have a female character. She's got slightly exaggerated features. She has a dress. Big deal, right? This is what that's going to add up to. We need to tell a story. And before we can tell a story, she has to act. And before she can act, we're going to have to teach her how to be human. Now, how do you do that? How do you trick the audience into believing that Elizabeth is human? Trick sounds like a bad word here, but it's true. We use a variety of tricks whose combinatorial effect added up to the illusion of humanity. And not only human, because that's not good enough, it has to be human that you want to spend time with. So these tricks are going to have to be executed through clever systems. We had early success with scripted moments. Scripted moments basically where you hard code her humanity into custom animations. And fully custom animation can be really high fidelity, but it's going to be really low interactivity. It's basically thinking about a cutscene, right? And we had early failures with systemic moments. Fully systemic moments are fairly low in fidelity, but they're very high in interactivity, meaning she can react to whatever the player is doing in that instant. Now, these fully systemic moments just happen to make up most of the game, so we need to figure that out. She needs to have that systemic humanity software running. So first off, what are the rules to being human? Movies take this for granted. Even the worst actress in the world, you will assume that she can walk onto a movie set and not trip on, she'll basic collision avoidance as she's walking across the set. Obeying these rules is either going to make or break the illusion of life. And it sounds like the boring stuff, but without this foundation, human isn't possible. And if the player is not experiencing Elizabeth as human, then we've failed. We need to, at the very least, get that person that can walk across the room. And in the movies, the illusion of life often refers to animation or how well an animation is done. But the best animation in the world isn't going to react to what the player is doing. So in an interactive setting, the illusion of life depends on the AI's reactions to the player, to other AIs. You can't have that relationship without interactivity. We need a small system that can combine together and create that illusion of life through these systems. So the illusion of humanity is pretty fragile. Think about the way you navigate through a level, and in this case, bad animation and bad pathfinding can really kill that illusion. The way somebody decides to stand next to you and look at you can really either creep you out or, it's not really somebody I want to spend time with. Even if she's standing there completely normal, but she's standing next to something so bizarre you want her to comment on it, can also take you out of the simulation. Even the way she chooses to deliver a line. Been nice to have audio on that one. Even if everything is working perfectly, but she's blinking, her blink rate is screwed up, your illusion is breaking quickly. So you realize that you get into these situations fairly quickly. Now, there's too many rules out there to script. There's too many to even know. Somebody doesn't even know there is a rule until you break it, right? And all humans are experts on being human, and assuming our audience is made up of humans, you're going to see these breakages right away. And because there are too many rules to list, we know that we can't script everything. We need to create these systems. So we created an internal team at Irrational called the Liz Squad. There's some members over here right now, actually. This is a multidisciplinary group. They were given the mandate of giving Elizabeth life. They were to implement solutions. And these solutions really had to be player-facing, meaning that they only had to exist for the player. If we needed to teleport Elizabeth somewhere, as long as the player wasn't aware of that, that's a perfectly viable thing. We don't need to obey Newtonian physics to create that illusion of life. And once those solutions are figured out, evangelizing those solutions to the team. The goal being that everybody knew how to use Elizabeth in their levels, and that we were going to stay away from scripting Elizabeth whenever possible. So one of the first systems we tackled was emotion. Elizabeth just had no emotion at all at the beginning. It disconnected her from the environment, disconnected her from the player. The relationship with her is going to suffer if you can't represent emotion. Now we created a motion system. It's basically a library of animations and facial expressions that she could play. These emotions could be either systemically triggered. If she saw something she didn't like or saw something she did like, the appropriate motion could be triggered on her. These emotions could also be scripted. If we needed to follow certain narrative events and we needed her to react a certain way to something, then we could certainly script that. And we also had a default emotion that was basically the catch-all. If something fell through the cracks, there was always an emotion there for her to fall back on. Now there's rules, right? These can't really be emotions. We can never have Elizabeth so mad at you that she just says, I'm not following you, right? Because then what are you going to do with the game? So there's a limit to how real these emotions can be. And these emotions had to sit on top of her movement animations. Very limited animations. We can't interfere with locomotion. We can't interfere with story narrative. But even these small animations can build a strong emotional connection. So I'll show you an example here. Here we have Elizabeth, a little bit shiny, but she's perfectly functional. She can head track me. She's playing the proper animations when she turns to face me. She can walk along with me, but she's completely dead. There's nothing going on there. She's just a mannequin. If you compare that to this, which is, let's make her angry. Let's give her some animations to play. Let's tell her when she should glance at me. Let's give her some expressions on her face. And underlying all of this, it's the same Elizabeth. She can still turn to face you. She can still walk. That locomotion system is still there. But these little animations, and it's funny coming from an animator, but I'm almost saying you kind of want to under-animate sometimes. These little animations can really add a lot to your character. And again, ultimately, it's how's the player going to experience this? So the ingredients of the emotion system included facial expressions, blinking frequency, VO, the type of VO that could play, feathered animations that affected only the arms and the head, and full body animations that would play when we knew that Elizabeth was standing still. Now, some of these emotions got specific as soon as we figured out that we could control her arms. Well, immediately we wanted her holding things. So you'll see emotions called flower or lantern, which aren't really emotions at all, but within the system or within the emotion system work perfectly well. And again, these were all things that had to sit on top of what she was doing or when she's following the player around in a level, completely systemic. So remembering that these have to combine with other systems, knowing that we can't prevent her from following the player or reacting appropriately to combat, or deciding not to react to combat because she's sad. Like I said, we're very limited what we could do with them, but I think the result of adding humanity onto her is pretty effective. Now, we discovered emotions that we didn't really think we'd need, like the after combat emotion. We had a problem early on where if Elizabeth was in a happy place and you started a combat and she'd go into her combat animations and then you shoot the last AI, she's going to stand right up and be happy again. So that kind of disconnected her from the world and the situation around her. So we built this after combat emotion that was a buffer between the last AI that was shot, a set period of designer-driven time, and then when she could go back to her narrative emotion. So she's kind of like sitting there catching her breath a little bit before she decided to be happy again. We also had emotions that were named after specific geographical locations. Throughout a linear narrative, you want Elizabeth to be a certain emotional state in a certain place. Well, you might as well just call that emotion boardwalk after funicular. It makes no sense to anyone outside of the development team, but that's the emotion we wanted her in at that particular spot. When we're developing the femme fatale version of Elizabeth and Burial at Sea in the DLC that we just released, we couldn't change any of the animations that we had shipped with, but we could create new content that plugged into the existing emotion system. So with fairly limited time and resources, we could take the Elizabeth from BioShock Infinite and turn her into a femme fatale with a 2-pack-a-day smoking habit. Again, smoking is not really an emotion, but when you're controlling arms and head, it's very easy to create smoking on top of her locomotion system. Now, this is a test that we did before we had the femme fatale mesh and Burial at Sea, so having a common rig certainly helps out with prototyping. Now, this system is just one small part of a whole. It's a combination of this with other systems that are going to create the illusion of life. Now, the gesture system, we had more VO for Elizabeth than we could ever possibly hope to animate. By my guess, I would say we had more VO in the Battleship Bay level of BioShock Infinite than we had in the entire game of BioShock 1. And it all had to be represented. Now, Face Effects did a huge job with helping us with lip syncing, but people don't just communicate with their mouths. You can see me up here wiggling my arms around. So we needed some shortcuts to get some of this animation in and running so that we could spice up some of her animations during her conversations. So we treated gestures like phonemes and facial animation. We could tag moments in VO to use a specific gesture. So when you say, I don't know, shrug your shoulders, and we could time that so the shrug came at the proper time. Gestures were used when we couldn't guarantee that Elizabeth was going to be locked into place. And she'll bail on these if she needs to run somewhere or move with the player. So again, they're completely systemic in that the player is not locked into place, nor is Elizabeth during these. Now, custom animations always look much better. You always want to hand animate this if you can, but again, high fidelity means low interactivity. All these custom animations would need to be done by an animator. Do you even have enough memory to fit all of these animations, let alone the time to do all these animations? So the gestures provided a quick way for us to get a little bit of life back into Elizabeth during the course of all the VO that she's going to say throughout the game. Now, these systems are used by anyone who's setting up VO, and by spreading out this responsibility throughout the team, we had a better chance of representing that VO than just having it not represented at all. So unfortunately, this video has talking in it, so we can all pretend, right? I just think my headphone jack is probably not working. Oops. It's definitely my headphone jack because that was loud. Sorry. In any case, you can see these are moments where she's talking to the player that the animators didn't have time to fully custom animate. A designer or a level builder or people come in and tell her to gesture at certain points in the animation so that she's not just standing there playing her normal idle when she's talking to you. Now, in these videos, I'm choosing to watch her, but in the game, it's absolutely not. She's not pinned into place. If the player decides to run over and start combat, then she's going to get into combat. She's not going to keep doing this and this with the player. So it's completely systemic. Now, this seems like a small system, head and eye tracking. I think everybody's familiar with this if anybody's played a first-person shooter. And it seems like a small thing, but the illusion of life is really about Elizabeth reacting to the world. This system lets us keep Elizabeth interested in the world around her, and sometimes, as I've shown, small things can go a long way. So the head and eye tracking system allowed for some randomness, and I think if any of you were at John Abercrombie's talk, you probably saw this slide. But it also allowed for designer-specified interest points. This is an example of somebody on the Liz squad deciding that they really, 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 really want Elizabeth to look at this painting. And even with the amount of eyeballs that were placed on this painting, she will only look at it if she can. Again, if she's locked into combat or if she's locked into a cutscene, these are opportunities for her, not scripted moments. And why is it important that Elizabeth look at this? Well, this is actually something that we want the player to see. It's a fairly important painting, and it's a fairly important part of the narrative in BioShock Infinite. And if you see Elizabeth looking at it and commenting on it, you might look at it too. If I go stand out in the hallway and just stand there and stare at the ceiling for a few minutes, I guarantee I'll have a few people come stand next to me and look at the ceiling. It's just part of human nature. So in some of this, we're using Elizabeth to kind of guide the player's eyes to things that we want to see without forcing them to do it. These placed interest points had instructions in there for her. Each icon contained these instructions, and in this case, you can see we really want her to look at this once. It's signage, but once she looks at it, she's not going to belabor the point. She'll see it and one and done. She'll express joy when she sees this, so the joy could be facial expression, it could be a vocalization of joy, or it could be a specific piece of VO that we want her to play. And we got to a point where these interest points could also be embedded in static meshes that are being made by modelers. And this is an interesting point because somebody making static meshes generally isn't involved with Elizabeth or characters. And it was kind of a way to get everybody involved with how is Elizabeth thinking about this? How is Elizabeth thinking about this mesh that you're building? By embedding a socket inside this mesh, you're being involved with that process of getting Elizabeth interested in the world and that illusion of life. So in this example, again, if you were at Crombie's talk, he used this too. We're about 40 minutes into an hour or so of just standing on the beach, not moving at all. So from a narrative standpoint, this is our worst nightmare. All the VO she's had to say has been said. She's nothing left for her to do. She's just standing around, walking and looking at random things. But the system is keeping her alive. This system, combined with the emotion of cotton candy, which puts the cotton candy in her hands, she's occasionally rubbing her belly, keeps that illusion of humanity going until the player is going to pick up the controller and start running off. So again, that's a worst case scenario there. So another system we developed was a smart terrain system. Now, a big part of the illusion of life is interacting with the world around you. Emotions and gestures are only going to take us so far. How does Elizabeth actually react to the world? We need a way to populate the world with interesting things that Elizabeth can interact with. Smart terrain objects contain information in them that Liz or other AIs could use. It wasn't just Liz. They were placed around the world by designers, by level builders. They contain rules in them for AIs, if they're allowed to use them or not. And they contain instructions like, am I going to animate? Is it a looping animation? How long is the looping animation? Do I use this intro or this outro, etc.? So this is a test I did early on where we took a single object, a flower bush, and saw different ways that Elizabeth could use it. Now, we're missing the attachment where she puts the flower in her hair here, but the idea is that she plucks a flower out from the bush. Now, in this case, she's plucking a flower from the bush. She's going into the flower emotion and going over to a dead body to put the flower on the dead body. Now, these interactions, which are a little more specialized than just sitting on a bench, were called gold moments. Now, these are things that we really wanted the player to see. Again, we did not want to force the player to see this. It was not about forcing the player into a cutscene. And she's about to break another rule here. Step on his head. But we called them gold moments. So in this case of the dead body, we'd probably place maybe 8 of them around a level and really kind of encourage Elizabeth to use them. Again, it's not scripted. It's just her systems kind of gravitate towards this thing and she wants to use it. Once she uses it, then it's done. We'll erase the rest of them so you don't have to see it again. Because again, it's a highly specialized moment that you really only want to see once because then it's special. The smart terrain is a great opportunity for us also to animate Elizabeth's animations at a higher fidelity and getting some interactivity there. Now, when you fill out a street with smart terrain, all of a sudden, Elizabeth is pretty connected to the world. In this example of a street, I just threw smart terrain everywhere for her to play with. Now, as a player, I'm cheating a little bit. We're also missing a little VO here, but that's okay. I'm cheating a little bit because I know where the VO is, the smart terrain is. I'm kind of turning to look to see if she's using the smart terrain over by the window that I placed. So it's cool that she's systemically using this. There is no scripting here. It's just her systems running and wanting to use the smart terrain. But like I said, I'm cheating. I know where everything is. And we're not shipping developers with the product to sit behind the players and tell them to look at certain things, right? We want to cheat this system a little bit to get the highest probability that the players will see these things. So this is where I was talking about earlier, like we could teleport Elizabeth into these smart terrains where she'd be locked into her first frame of animation. And if the player turned and saw her, she would just continue the animation as she just started. If the player never turned and saw her, she could teleport out or into another smart terrain. Now in this particular case, I really think she's moving over to the railing because I put smart terrain here and I'm a little bit surprised she's not here. And I turned just in time to see her kick this guy in the nuts. His hat falls off, he sits down, and she goes over to the railing. Now, it's a little sloppy, but it's amazing that for me, as a jaded developer, I can get surprised by these systems I've been working with daily. And when I sit down to shoot the video that I've run through this thing a million times, all of a sudden it's different because that AI happened to be next to her when I filmed this. So if the systems are working, that's great. It means that we're getting closer to that illusion of life. The smart terrain is almost too easy to place. We had to be careful. Certainly, you didn't want to put so much smart terrain and diverse smart terrain around that you're blowing out the memory budgets. Liz Squad managed this system, and they also paid attention to the context. What is Liz's mood? You don't want Liz playfully picking a flower if it's a somber art part of the story. You want to kind of feed into the narrative at all times here. In this final example of smart terrain, this is an example of what Elizabeth sees in the editor. All the green objects represent smart terrain, not just for Elizabeth, but that other AIs could use. We had mesh previews for specific objects, so we knew that when we placed it correctly, our hands wouldn't be clipping through the railing. We had freestanding smart terrain that didn't involve meshes, and those are the green diamonds that you see. So Elizabeth, walking through this level, all these green things were opportunities for her to use if she was available to use them at the time. So let's get into combat. Combat was a big issue for us. Early on in production, we didn't really know what to do with her. Elizabeth was not going to be a combat AI. We didn't really want her holding a gun and shooting people. That wasn't part of her character. And early on during level reviews, you would pause the game and stop and turn out and look at the level designer and be like, where's Elizabeth? And a lot of times the answer was, I put her in the room back there so she's out of the way. It doesn't bother you. So if we're going to build a relationship with Elizabeth, that's not how we're going to do this. We needed to keep her present at all times, even during combat, and in a manner that was helpful to the player. Now, Elizabeth can't get killed. Narratively, we don't support her dying, but we don't want to highlight that, right? We don't want her to ignore dangerous things and just highlight the fact that she's got godlike powers. Selling awareness to danger is good because the player can die, so things that are not dangerous to her are dangerous to the player. But it also grounds Elizabeth to the world. Reacting to her situation, furthers that illusion of life. So an example, again, of under-animating here. This is a single frame animation that we added to her run cycle that provided a flinch-like behavior when bullets happen to fly near her. So if you see in this situation, she's running upright, and as soon as the gunshots start going off, she just plays an animation where she puts her head down and her arms come up, so it feels like she's protecting herself. And again, nothing gets affected as far as locomotion, nothing gets affected as far as design. Single frame animation, fairly effective at selling that situational awareness. So what else can we do? We added cover. We added flinching and peeking to the cover. When I say cover, I mean cover for Elizabeth. And this is cover that we didn't necessarily have to place. It would get built when you build the paths, and she would understand what she could post up against and go into her cover animations. We added peeking to give her a bit of a directed awareness to danger. It's all eye candy, but it's another ingredient towards building those layers of combinatorial effects for illusion of life. We also had to add a cooldown to the flinch because on an automatic weapon, she was doing this a lot in our first playthrough. Peeking, it's a subtle thing and it's not important, but it kind of directs the player in the direction of where the danger is coming from. You'll also see here when this AI dies, this is before we had the after combat behavior. So you'll see Elizabeth pop right up and be ready to go. Whoop, like nothing happened. So again, going back to the emotion system there. So far, it's just eye candy, right? We need to sink our teeth into some design issues also. So this is an early test that we did with Elizabeth in combat, and I think it's a good example of getting everything wrong. So you can tell by the title, this is one of our first attempts at book or catch. So when we first started this, we were so concerned with where the weapon was coming from because Liz had these tear powers, and let's put the tear powers in, and she pulls this weapon out of the tear, that became the story. It wasn't the story of Elizabeth coming to help me, it was the story of where did this weapon come from, this crazy tear, right? Not only that, I have to look at her. I have to wait for the animation and the effect to play. I have to push a button to pick up the weapon. Once that's done, then I have to remember where I was looking when I was in combat, and by then somebody shot me and I'm dead. So all of these should be combined, right? It shouldn't be so much work for the player that they're never going to use this system. So we've settled on a one-button press solution. Ultimately, this was no more complicated than a normal reload. And something weird happened. It turned out that improving the design also improves the narrative. We started to hear war stories around the office. You know, I was down to my last bullet and Elizabeth threw me a weapon at the last second. People aren't saying what the system actually is, which is essentially a reload. They're talking about it through the lens of this companion character coming to help you and saving you at the last minute. So from a narrative standpoint, we're building that relationship with the player without even realizing it. So again, the player experience and the illusion of life working here. Now in a shooter, the player dies a lot. We struggled a bit with the mechanics of resurrection. And eventually taking a page out of Book or Catch, tying Elizabeth to the resurrection system. Now from a design standpoint, again, this is just a res station. It's where you come back to respawn once you die, or narratively, Booker doesn't die, he gets revived. But we're creating an emotional connection here by having it go through the lens of Elizabeth. Now this final example I'll show you shows the combination of systems that Elizabeth uses in combat. There's threat location. We're going to see UI put up on the HUD. Unfortunately, we're not going to actually hear. The weapon reload, tears, which I didn't go into today, and the resurrection. So Elizabeth is shouting to me now that there's a flat cannon, and now I see a HUD element up on there showing me where the dangerous guy is. She's given me a weapon on an empty reload. And now, as I run around here, you can see why nobody wants me on their battlefield squad. I'm trying to get killed, I promise. And when I eventually get killed, you know, we play the animation and some screen effects of her bringing the player back and ready to go back into the combat. So this sequence, which is fairly common first-person shooter sequence, right? There's a reload, there's shooting, there's dying and resurrection. We're doing this all through the lens of Elizabeth and her, you know, her being there with you. So that narrative and that relationship is building between you two because we're attaching her to these systems. So I'll talk a little about process here. Out of our systemic behavior, outside of systemic behaviors, we still need to build cutscenes. For this final section, I'll talk a little about that process. Unfortunately, this is where probably want audio, but we're not going to hear it. She was our most ambitious character yet. By the time we started production on Infinite, we only had 4 animators on staff at the time. We needed to be as efficient as possible, and quick iteration for us was definitely key. We needed to have time to make mistakes, and we needed time to polish. We went with pre-recorded VO, partially due to the fact that we weren't doing performance capture. But pre-recorded VO really allowed us to do tightly controlled editing of VO and conversations. Now, Ken Levine directs most of the VO sessions. He gets great performances from the actors. Those performances are then taken back to Irrational and edited into a tightly controlled conversation. Takes are mixed and matched to the best possible result. And really, as animators, we're left with top-notch acting that's ours to mess up. No pressure. In this example, this is a video that was shot for the animators for facial reference. So this is the beach scene where Booker finds Elizabeth dancing on the boardwalk. These videos were constructed explicitly for the animators because, again, we weren't doing facial capture. We were doing hand-keyed. The screen is going to be black during Troy Baker's lines, which, again, we won't hear because we weren't doing animation on Booker. And you'll see Courtney Draper go through multiple clothing changes and lighting changes because the takes that we're selecting from her are happening on different days and possibly, I think it's the same studio, but some of them were actually from different studios. So black is when Booker's talking. Actually, without the audio, you probably see the cuts much clearer. So rarely did we take single takes. We really dug down deep into the VO and really figured out like what was the best possible take for this VO and just, you know, mix them all together. So we use mocap on the set We used the VO on the set to mocap too. Heather Gordon was the actress that played Elizabeth in the mocap studio, and she did a fantastic job. I wish I had time to show you her audition reel, but it's really, for me, more theater than movie that I was looking for, and she really knew how to express herself to the person in the last row. And I could direct these scenes remotely, partially because a lot of the scenes were Elizabeth and Booker was not represented by a human, a camera, right? So I could really just concentrate on her physical performance. I didn't have to deal with multiple people on set at a time. So direct, I'm in Boston, she's in San Francisco. That worked out because I could really focus on the physical performance, and I could do multiple different iterations of that physical performance. And the motion capture gave us a baseline to work with. When you grow to numerous animators, both on-site and off, you want that common baseline. So here's Heather acting along to the beach VO we just heard. You're going to see Steve Park, the motion capture coordinator at 2K Novato, standing in for Booker. So she's dancing along to the music, and then we kick into the VO. And again, because we already established the VO, I could do multiple takes of these throughout a day and really pick and choose the strongest take. And 2K Novato is very quick in getting these back to me. Sometimes same day I could have usable animation on my desktop ready to go. So here's where the scene comes together. We always animate on top of the mocap. We very rarely put in raw mocap. Again, we weren't going for realism, we were going for emotion. The raw mocap is great for proving out a scene, but once we've proved out the timing and get the sense that we know where we're going with the scene, we would do extensive animation on it. So, we'll sum this up. What did we learn throughout the development of Elizabeth and BioShock Infinite? Pre-production is a great place to have fun, but you can't get stuck here. You have to commit to something, and it means making tough decisions. And it doesn't seem like it now, but making the decision to make Liz a talking character was hugely controversial around the office at the time. And the reason that we made the decision that Elizabeth had to talk leads me to my second point, which is show it to me in engine. How is the player going to perceive this great idea that you have? Is it fun? Does it elicit the reactions that you want? I can point at the Booker catch example also. The player experience is everything. Failing is good, but if you're going to fail, fail quickly. Zach touched on this a little on his. You want to learn from the mistakes that you've made. And if you can fail, fail from the player's point of view if you have the opportunity to, because you'll learn something from that. Now, as far as Liz's humanity go and the systems that we put together, I think we were all surprised by the little things that we could do to make Elizabeth feel more human. And these systems combined together with powerful results. And each one of these systems taken on their own weren't necessarily that difficult to, I say that not being a programmer, hi guys, not that difficult to create, but the way that they combined together provided us a really robust illusion of humanity. And that leads me to trust the player. When you're not doing a cutscene, you have to let go of the player and trust that they're going to want to be involved in your narrative and not just shoot at Elizabeth or throw things at her head. You're going to get a much stronger emotional connection when the systems define the relationship, because it's going to be reactive to the player and it's going to be personal to the player. And narrative opportunities are everywhere. Reinforce your character at every chance. Even boring game systems can be used to reinforce a relationship. Resurrection, reloading, the HUD callouts, which you actually didn't hear, but all those systems feed back through Elizabeth so that you feel like she's there next to you and helping you out. So for process, process is different for every studio. Certainly being at GDC it reinforces that. We had to find a process that worked for Rational. For sure, not having the option for performance capture went a long way to defining what our animation pipeline was. mix up your departments. The Liz Squad was a huge success for us. Not only did it enable better communication because you have people from different departments working tightly together, you tend to lose that ego that you might get if it's like just the animators working on something because they know how it wants to be, so they're gonna be in their little fiefdom and controlling what they want. Once you start thinking about the player experience, once you start thinking about how everybody's role is connected in creating this person, then you're gonna get a much better or a much higher quality product. And cutscenes. Now, we obviously relied heavily on cutscenes, and I didn't go into too much of them today. And I am very proud of the work that my team and I accomplished with them. But we need to push past cutscenes to what's next for narrative in games. I want to bridge that gap between that high fidelity and high interactivity that I talked about earlier. You want to allow each player to have an individual and unique experience. And I certainly hope I can stand here after our next project and talk about cutscenes the same way I talked about disembodied voices and humans behind glass that I did at the beginning of this talk. I'd also strongly recommend checking out Ken Levine's narrative Lego talk. I believe that's tomorrow at 12. I know it's tomorrow, I don't know the time, for more information on what we're thinking about on this subject. Well, that brings me to the end. Thank you very much for coming. And yeah, thank you.